On my son's wedding day, I was pushed out of the venue like an unwanted guest, just because I looked too rustic. I left quietly, carrying the pain that no one bothered to ask about. But a week later, the same son who turned his back on me came to me, panicked and desperate because of secrets that had been exposed. I didn't seek revenge. I just stood up, reclaimed my place, and made sure he could never forget me again. Before diving into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit like, and comment where you're watching from. Let me know what time it is where you are right now. I had always thought that watching my son stand at the altar, wearing the tuxedo I quietly paid for in installments over 6 months, would be the proudest moment of my life. I imagined I'd be teary-eyed seeing him kiss the bride's forehead, that people would pat my shoulder and say, "You've got a wonderful son." Instead, I was called outside, standing by the trash bins behind the reception hall, where no one could hear anything except the sound of the flower delivery truck passing by. He looked at me awkwardly, scratching his neck, then whispered as if afraid someone might overhear, "Dad, I know you mean well, but you're making people uncomfortable. The way you're dressed, the way you talk, that wrinkled shirt. We just want everything to be perfect today. You understand, right?" I stood frozen. In my hand was the wedding envelope with "Dad loves you" written by hand. I hadn't even sat down to eat. I hadn't yet congratulated the bride. I just looked straight into his eyes and asked, slowly, softly, "You mean I should leave?" He nodded, this time not hiding his impatience. "Don't be mad, Dad, but, my wife's friends are all Ivy League grads. Some of the bride's side kept asking who the guy in the old shirt at the corner table was. I just want today to be the best day, and you're making us feel embarrassed." I smiled, not out of joy. It was just that my face didn't know how else to react. I nodded, placed the envelope on the table next to a potted plant, and turned to leave. I walked out as the music played the first slow dance, amid the clinking glasses and toasts, and past the glances of a few old-school friends I hadn't even had a chance to greet. I got in my car, started the engine, and left before they served the appetizers. No one called me back. No one sent a text to check on me. The wedding of the son I raised with my blood, sweat, and fading years ended for me like that. On the drive home, I didn't cry. I thought of only one thing: being a father. It turns out doesn't always mean being honored on the big day. Sometimes you're just a shadow people want to avoid. And in the eyes of the son I loved most, I was just someone who embarrassed him. I drove in silence. No radio, no air conditioning, just the sound of tires rolling on cold asphalt, occasionally punctuated by the ping of small rocks hitting the undercarriage, like someone tapping at my memories. I turned left at the intersection where I used to take him to school every morning, passing the small road cutting through the old stadium where he scored his first goal in life, and I clapped until my palms stung, even though it was just a neighborhood kids tournament. When a red light held me up for over a minute, I quietly glanced at the rearview mirror. My face reflected back, pale, sagging with the years. But what startled me was my eyes, not sad, but empty. Not angry, not resentful, just unable to comprehend what had just happened. I, who spent my life building a solid foundation for my son, had just been told by that same son, "You're embarrassing me." I stopped at a convenience store on the way, grabbed a pre-made coffee from the machine, and sat in the car, placing the cup on the still warm hood. The smell of plastic and weak coffee mixed in the late-day chill reminded me of 5 years ago when I quietly worked night shifts at a warehouse just to afford his summer program in New York. I never complained. I never asked for anything. I thought that's what being a father was, just wanting him to succeed, to smile. But tonight, I realized that sometimes what I thought was enough was actually too much in someone else's eyes. I got home past 9. The house was pitch dark. The porch light flickered like it mirrored my mood. I didn't turn on the light right away. I went straight to the living room table where the vase of flowers I'd bought that morning to give the bride still sat forgotten because I was called out too soon. I pulled the "Dad loves you" card from my pocket and placed it in the vase. My fingers trembled as I set it down. Maybe from the cold, maybe from shame. Probably both. I sat on the sofa, the dim light from the window enough to make out the framed photo on the wall. Me and my son grinning ear to ear by the Santa Monica shore the year he turned 10. I remember that day clearly. I sold my old motorcycle to afford plane tickets and a rental near the beach. He said it was the happiest day of his life. I believed it. I lived off that belief for years. Yet today, that same boy made me realize that belief can run dry, and a father-son bond can be erased at a wedding reception. I didn't turn on the TV or eat. I sat there until midnight, not because I couldn't sleep, but because I didn't know where to go in my own house. Because tonight, I wasn't just kicked out of the wedding. I was pushed out of my role as a father, silently, coldly, and reasonably in the eyes of others, and that hurt the most. I woke up at 6 a.m. the next day without an alarm. The house was still as silent as the night before, except the sky outside had turned a muted gray, as if it were holding back anger for me. I brewed an old pot of tea, reusing the second steep of a leftover tea bag, and sat at the dining table, where my laptop, worn from years of use, waited. I opened an old Excel file named Ben's Education Costs, Kindergarten to College. I last updated it 3 years ago when he graduated with his MBA in San Diego. I scrolled through the entries. Elementary school tuition, $7,440 a year. Uniforms, $365. Fifth grade field trip, $150. SAT prep in 11th grade, $1,000. Plane tickets home for holidays, over 12 trips in 6 years. Not one expense was small, but I never calculated. I just paid, worked extra shifts, borrowed when needed, and always hid it from him. I didn't want him to feel indebted. I wanted him to feel free, comfortable, to have the youth I never had. But this morning, I looked at those numbers with different eyes. I didn't regret it, but I wondered, did he ever realize those things didn't come from thin air? I opened another folder, post-college support. Inside were bank transfer receipts. I helped him with a deposit for his first apartment when he moved out, paid half the installments for the car he drives to work, and covered 3 months of the wedding venue's rent because the bride's family wanted a fancier location. He told me, "Don't worry, Dad, we'll pay you back after the wedding." I didn't ask for it. I just nodded as always. In the desk drawer, I pulled out a large envelope where I kept all the printed emails between me and the wedding planners. One letter clearly listed my name as the financial guarantor for the bride's side's meals, over 80 people. I once thought it was an honor. Now I'm not so sure. There was one receipt I kept carefully, the invoice for the wedding ring, not mine, my son's. 2 years ago, he texted me at midnight, asking to borrow $6,500 for the diamond ring his fiancée wanted. He wrote, "Only you get me, Dad. Help me out this one time." I sent the money the next morning. In the transfer note, I typed, "A gift from a father who loves you." He didn't reply, never mentioned it again. I didn't ask for it back. I always thought if my son could hold his head high, giving that ring on his big day without worrying about the cost, it was all worth it. But now, looking back at everything I gave, from small things like his first suit for a job interview, to intangibles like encouragement, sleepless nights, and nameless sacrifices, I realized something. I gave so much that I left no room for gratitude to exist. Maybe I taught him that love doesn't need reciprocation. Maybe I blurred the concept of acknowledgement myself. I stood up, opened the last drawer where I kept a small wooden box. Inside was the first savings book I started after my wife passed. Each month I put in $100, calling it emergency fund for when my son grows up. Now it only has a few hundred left. Most went to the wedding I didn't get to fully attend. I closed the box, my heart heavy, not because I regretted the money, but because I realized I'd become such a silent foundation that I was taken for granted. My son never knew those gifts existed, not because he was heartless, but because I never let him know. I always stood behind the curtain, pulling the strings for him to shine. But now he's grown and forgotten who's pulling the strings. Maybe the fault isn't entirely his. Maybe I need to learn to show up, not as a helper anymore, but as someone with real value, a father not just to give, but to be seen. And I swear from now on, I won't let my love be taken as a default payment. Every gift, if there is one, will come with conditions, kindness, respect, and a minimal thank you. That's not a demand. It's what a father who's carried a lifetime silently deserves to learn to love himself properly. The photo sits in the middle of the living room's wooden shelf, under a wall clock whose hands stopped months ago. It's the only family photo I still have, taken on a summer afternoon 17 years ago, when he was a third grader, and my wife was still by my side, her arm lightly around my shoulder, her eyes radiant as if life still held endless warmth ahead. We wore jeans, sitting on a checkered blanket in Griffith Park, Los Angeles. That day, I brought a borrowed film camera from a coworker at the factory. I didn't know how to focus, and all three of us were slightly off frame, but it's the most perfect photo. I stared at it in silence for a long time. My hand reached to wipe dust from the frame's edge, but stopped midway. This noon, as I passed by their house to return the rented suit, I saw that same photo face down on a table by the door. Maybe it was accidental, maybe intentional. I didn't ask. I no longer had the courage to ask. But I clearly remember that photo sat on his desk all through high school. Before every exam, I'd pat his shoulder and say, "Mom and I are always behind you." It wasn't just a saying. It was the way I chose to live, always in the background. When his mother passed, I thought I couldn't do it alone. I was clumsy, didn't know how to braid hair, cook well, or sing lullabies. But I learned. I learned everything from scratch: how to braid a child's hair, make pancakes without burning them, buy the best diapers when he had diarrhea. I had no one to ask for help. No relatives, no close friends. It was just him and me, and he only had me. Those years I worked night shifts at a warehouse and taught daytime classes at an old car repair center. I didn't get home before 9 p.m. for 3 straight years. Every night I'd quietly open his door to check if he'd pulled up his blanket. Some nights, too exhausted, I'd sit outside his room, dozing off on the cold tile floor without turning on the light. I didn't complain. I didn't tell anyone, because I thought, as long as he grew up decent, it was all worth it. But I never expected that when he truly grew up, the first thing he'd do was push me out of his life's picture. Maybe because I didn't fit the frame he wanted to build. A clean, tidy life wrapped in parents with clear titles, shiny company name tags, and perfectly fitted suits. And me, I was just an old crease in that perfect picture. A father no one wanted to see anymore. I walked back to the wooden shelf, for the first time in months holding the frame with both hands. The teak frame, slightly scratched at one corner from falling during last year's move. I never replaced the photo. Not because I didn't have others, but because I was afraid replacing it would erase the one memory I knew was real. A family that once laughed happily. I brought the frame to my desk, placing it right in the center, where this morning I'd checked every invoice and receipt my son never knew about. I looked at the faces in the photo, the trusting eyes of that child, looking up at me like we were the only two people in the world, and me in the photo, still smiling. But that smile now stood in stark contrast to the faint one I forced at yesterday's wedding. When my son said, "You're embarrassing me," I bowed my head, for the first time in years placing my hand on my forehead, not from a headache, but from a loneliness that seeped into my bones. Maybe I raised him too well, so well that he didn't know how harsh the world would have been without a father, hauling cargo for 20 years to ensure he never went hungry. Maybe I made him believe his dad never needed to be heard, only needed to be asked for help. I sat there until the afternoon, my hand still on the frame. In a moment of weakness, I almost turned it face down like he did. But then I reconsidered. No, I won't do that. I don't need my son to worship the past. But I need myself to remember I was once important in his life. I was once the centerpiece of our family portrait, not a passerby pushed out of the frame. So I sat up straight, set the frame upright, wiped off every last speck of dust, and turned on the desk lamp for the first time in months, as if to tell myself, I'm still here, and I'm still his father, whether he remembers or not. That night, in a rare moment of emotion no longer fueled by anger but by desolation, I opened my phone again. I scrolled through old texts, conversations between me and my son, silent since the wedding. In my contacts, his name is still saved as Ben, Dad's little guy. I didn't change it, maybe because I'm not used to him being a married man. I clicked into the group chat named Family, one I created in 2016, the day he got a full scholarship to college in Chicago. The group once had 3 people, me, him, and his then-girlfriend, now wife. The messages read like a scattered diary. Sent the money, son. Eat well. Thanks, Dad. You're a superhero. Dad, can you check the file I sent quick? I need it for tomorrow's proposal. Conversations full of thanks, trust, and sometimes long confessions from my son during stressful days of these interviews and young adult pressures. I always replied as fast as I could, even during night shifts or while hauling boxes at the warehouse. I never made him wait long. But tonight, when I sent a simple message, "I'm home, good night to you both," it disappeared after 10 minutes. I didn't delete it, I checked again. The notification was clear. Message removed by group admin. I stared at it, my finger frozen on the screen. I couldn't believe my eyes. I tried again. Just wanted to wish you both a peaceful first night. This time, I didn't even see the message appear. A notification popped up. You are no longer a member of the family group. I was removed. Silently, without warning, without a single explanation. I closed the app, like someone who'd just been slapped. The pain wasn't from surprise, but from the chilling clarity. I was no longer seen as family to him. I don't know if it was my son or his wife who did it, but that doesn't matter. What matters is that my attempt to check in something so utterly normal was seen as a nuisance. The past, where I was his rock, his support, every time he stumbled, has been replaced by another voice, another priority, another frame of reference. I stepped out to the porch, sitting on the familiar wooden chair where I used to drink tea and call him every Sunday morning for years. Tonight, for the first time, the chair felt too big, not because I'd lost weight, but because I felt smaller. I opened Facebook, a platform I rarely use but silently followed him on. His page was full of wedding photos, pictures I'd never seen, sparkling moments captured from every angle, cake cutting, dancing, the bride and groom embracing under fireworks. I searched for myself in any frame, nothing, not a single one. I scrolled to the comments. Someone asked, "Where are the parents?" Didn't see them in the photos. The bride's reply stopped me cold. The groom's side doesn't like being photographed, wanted privacy. I don't like being photographed. I used to carry a camera everywhere to capture every moment of my son's growth. I took over 1,200 photos in his first year of college alone. But tonight, at his own wedding, I was the one erased from every frame, erased from even the most basic presents, a family group chat. I went back inside, turned on the kitchen light. From the magnetic board where this year's calendar hung, I took down the notes my son wrote as a kid. Dad, don't forget parent-teacher meeting at 3. I have a test tomorrow. Make egg porridge, Dad. Take me to get a haircut Saturday. Don't forget. I'd kept them for over 15 years, each piece of paper yellowed by time. But I never threw them out. Tonight I gathered them, placed them in an envelope. I didn't burn them. I didn't put them away. I left the envelope on the dining table at the exact spot where I used to help him with homework after dinner. I left it there to remind myself I was once important. Even though I've been removed from the group, silently erased from the family I built myself, it doesn't change the truth that I was once the only place that child turned to. I sat down, wrote 2 lines on the envelope. Things you forgot, things I remember, and I left it as is, without locking the drawer, without closing my heart. I'm not angry, I'm just listening, for the first time in my life, to the sound of being left behind. Not because I was wrong, but because someone chose to forget who I am. And if one day he comes back, I'll let him read it, not for an apology, but so he understands. The person erased from a group doesn't just vanish. Some people are still there, just standing outside the frame, silently, waiting to be called back by the name they deserve. Dad, I was in the garage wiping down an old wrench, a tool that's been with me for nearly 30 years, when my phone rang. An unknown number from the bank's call center. I answered without thinking much. Hello, sir, a polite female voice said. We're calling to verify some unusual transactions from the joint account under your name and Benjamin L. Carter. I froze. It was the account I opened with my son when he started college for easy transfers of tuition, living expenses, and occasional emergency credit card payments. I clearly remember his promise back then. Don't worry, Dad. I'll only use it when I really need to. When I get married, I'll open my own account. And I believed him. I believed every word he said. Can you confirm the transactions from the past week? A deposit for a honeymoon resort in Hawaii for $4,500. First payment for new sofa and furniture, $6,800, and a transfer to an individual account under Madison Carter, $3,000. I went rigid for a few seconds. Each number felt like a knife slicing into the fragile trust I had left after the wedding. I tried to keep my voice calm. No, I didn't make those transactions. On the other end, the bank employee hesitated. Then we'll temporarily freeze the account for investigation and send you a complaint form. But since it's a joint account, the other party will also be notified. I replied curtly. Do what you need to do. Then I hung up. I sat still for a long time, staring at the oil-stained wall. It wasn't anger anymore, but a kind of cool disappointment, like finding out a broken lock left your house open for a month without you noticing. I wasn't mad about the money. I've spent more than that without hesitation. But what weighed on my heart was the secrecy, the use without permission, without asking, without a single heads up. After everything, the wedding I was pushed out of, the family group I was removed from, the messages no one answered now, the account I set up to support his first steps in life was being used to pay for things I wasn't allowed to be part of. A lavish honeymoon, a sofa I wasn't invited to sit on, a new apartment whose address this old father doesn't know. I went to the kitchen, opened the drawer where I keep all the bank statements, records, and important documents. I dug out the joint account agreement, the paperwork I signed the day my son turned 18. I remember that day. He'd just gotten his college acceptance letter, jumping with joy. I smiled and said, I'll open an account to walk with you through this new journey. That day, he hugged me tightly. I thought that hug was a promise. Turns out it was just a goodbye to a naive time. I held the contract, placed it on the table next to the complaint form the bank emailed. I signed it. My hand shook, not from anger but from pain. It felt like cutting off a part of my body that was once attached, knowing that if I didn't, it would keep rotting my trust. That afternoon, I got a text from an unknown number. Dad, the bank just notified me about the account being frozen. What's going on? I only used it for urgent stuff. Please understand. No apology, no checking in. Just, once again, an assumption that I'd understand, forgive, open the door again. I didn't reply. I no longer had a reason to keep being the open door for someone who doesn't bother to knock. I just looked up, around my house where every item was earned by my own hands. Nothing fancy. But every dollar came from sweat and trust. Now that trust had been withdrawn like a debt with no repayment. And I knew it was time to close the book, not because I wanted to cut ties, but because I wanted to protect myself for the first time in all my years as a father. The next morning I went to the nearby supermarket as usual. My basket had just a few simple things, a carton of eggs, a loaf of rye bread, the cheapest coffee. I don't have many needs. A man living alone past 60 doesn't need much. I stood in line, waiting to pay, holding my familiar debit card. But when the cashier scanned it, the POS machine let out a blunt beep. Your card was declined, sir. the young cashier said softly, trying to be polite, but I could hear the pity in her voice. Do you have another card? I froze. I checked my wallet. Only that one card. All my transactions, pension, living expenses were tied to that one account, the one linked to my son, the one I'd signed the complaint for and requested to freeze yesterday. I swallowed hard, pulled out my phone to check when it buzzed, a call from my son. The first time since the wedding, he called. Not a text, not an email, a direct call. I stepped aside and answered. His voice came through immediately, rushed and unsteady. Dad, the account's frozen. We're at the airport. Can't check in. All our expenses are tied to my card, and it's not working anymore. I heard wind rushing through the phone and someone, probably his wife, yelling, Call your dad. Why is it suddenly not working? He continued. Did you really freeze the account? Why would you do that? I told you I only used it for a few things. You know, after the wedding, there's a ton to deal with. I cut him off. You're right. There's a lot to deal with. But does that include using someone else's money without asking? Silence on the other end. I heard his heavy breathing. Then he said, softer, trembling, Dad, I thought we had that right. I gave a dry laugh, not out of joy. A right? On an account I opened with money I earned without a single word beforehand? You thought that was a right? I glanced at my grocery basket still on the counter. The eggs and bread were pushed aside, like no one wanted them anymore. I'm at the supermarket, I said. My card was declined. Do you know what that feels like? A father standing there embarrassed because his own account was drained by someone without permission. He went quiet. Then his voice cracked, like he was holding on to his last bit of composure. Dad, I'm sorry, we didn't mean to. We just thought you'd understand. I did understand, I said, my eyes fixed on the mirror behind the counter, where I saw myself, a thin, gray-haired man with a face full of wrinkles from years and betrayed trust. I understand that sometimes love isn't returned with gratitude, but with disregard. I hung up, not waiting for him to say more. For the first time in my life, I felt I did the right thing by cutting him off. Not because I wanted to be angry, but because I didn't want my kindness to be taken advantage of anymore. I went back to the counter, pulled out my wallet, counted the cash I had left. Enough for the bread and eggs. I nodded to the cashier. Take the coffee out. Tea's fine for today. She gave an awkward smile. I didn't. I carried my bag home, each step slow but steady. And as I opened the gate, my phone buzzed again. A text from my son. Dad, I messed up. Please, just lend us $2,000 for this trip. We'll pay it back when we're home. I promise. No question mark. No real plea. Just a command dressed as a request. I turned off the screen, set the phone on the table. Then I sat down, picked up the envelope marked Things You Forgot, Things I Remember, opened it and added one more line, August 17. You called, not because you missed me, but because the card was declined. And I folded it shut, not to hold a grudge, but to remember. Because this time, I didn't want to forget anything else. I still remember that night clearly, the pouring rain 14 years ago, when I knelt before the hospital pharmacy counter, clutching a prescription for special antibiotics costing nearly $300, with only $83 in my wallet. My son had a 40-degree fever for 3 days straight. The doctor said if he didn't get the medicine in time, his brain could be permanently damaged. I ran to the pharmacy past 10 p.m., rain pounding the metal awning like a roar. I was soaked, head to toe, hands shaking as I held out the prescription. The young pharmacist pursed her lips when she saw the price, then said softly, Your insurance doesn't cover this drug. There's a weaker generic, but it's not as effective. I didn't have time to hesitate. I set my wallet down, rummaged through every pocket, pulling out every bill, every coin. Still not enough. I stood frozen for a few seconds. Then, like an uncontrollable reflex, I knelt down, looking at the girl behind the counter. Please keep my ID if you have to. Let me take the medicine now. I'll come back tomorrow to pay. I'm begging you. She looked flustered, glancing around, then whispered, Please don't do that. Stand up, sir. But I couldn't stand. Not because I wanted to beg, but because my legs had no strength left. I'd spent the day doing construction and driving passengers. When I got the call from his teacher saying he'd fainted in class, I rushed over with nothing but my hands, bloodied from mixing cement that morning. I don't remember how long I stayed there, only that, in the end, a man in a long coat, likely the pharmacy supervisor, came over, whispered to the pharmacist, then turned to me, You brought your son in just in time. We'll provide the first dose now. You can come back tomorrow to settle the rest. But don't kneel like that again. I nodded, unable to speak. I took the medicine, holding it tightly like it was my own lifeline. I ran back to the ward, where my son lay unconscious, his forehead burning. I never told him about kneeling. I only said, The doctor gave the medicine. I'm here. Everything will be okay. The next morning, I sold the only keepsake watch from my wife, a watch engraved with To the Greatest Father, to pay for the rest of the medicine. No hesitation, no regret, as long as my son got better. And he did. 3 days later, the fever broke, his eyes opened, and he looked at me, lips trembling. "Did you sleep, Dad?" I smiled. "Of course, I slept right next to you." He nodded and drifted off. Today, years later, looking back on my life, I still think that moment was one of my greatest victories, not because I was great, but because I didn't give up. I used every ounce of determination to keep my son alive. I set aside my pride, knelt, just to give him one more chance to breathe. And now, when that same son coldly texts, demanding money for a honeymoon, when the account is misused, when I'm removed from the group chat, when my messages are deleted, and when my presence is just a nuisance, I want him to know, no, I need him to understand that the father he's trying to push aside was the one who once knelt before a pharmacy counter, loving him beyond all limits. I don't need his gratitude, I just want him to remember. And if he doesn't, I'll remember for him, even if the whole world chooses to forget. I was brewing morning tea when an email notification chimed. At first, I meant to ignore it. I wasn't expecting anything from my inbox except outdated sale ads, but the subject line stopped me cold. Regarding Benjamin Carter's job application, verification of guarantor information. The sender was a recruiter from a major architecture firm in San Diego, a name my son once called his lifelong dream to work for. I opened the email. The content was brief but enough to chill me. "Dear Mr. Carter, we've received an application from Benjamin Carter for a project manager position at our company. In his application, he listed you as the supervisor for his freelance projects and co-guarantor for his internship at Southwest Urban Design 2022-2023. We need you to confirm this information. Specifically, did you directly supervise these projects? Are the attached files signed by you? Please respond by the 19th to meet the final review deadline." I sat down, opened the attached files. A series of project reports bearing my name, my signature, formatted exactly like the ones I used to do as a freelancer. But one thing was glaringly wrong. I never supervised any projects under Ben's name. I never signed those documents. The signatures were fake, or copied from somewhere and pasted in. I opened my old archive folder. Within minutes, I found a matching document from 2021, a technical report I did for a small startup. Every number, every chart was identical, except the project leader's name had been changed from Thomas Carter to Benjamin Carter. Even the footnote, "Reuse of this document requires the author's consent," was still there. I leaned back in my chair, hands limp, not out of anger, but because I never imagined the son I raised day by day, the boy who once cried over a wrong multiplication table, could sink so low as to use my work to fabricate credentials he never earned. I remembered him saying, "I'm trying to find a serious job, Dad, don't worry." I believed him. I never questioned, never checked. I just encouraged him, sent money when he said, "This month's tight, Dad, help me out a bit." And yet, I'd been made an unwitting accomplice. A guarantor for a resume built on lies. I thought about this, eyes still on the email, the cursor blinking in the reply box. I could stay silent. I could look the other way, pretend I didn't see it, give him a chance to land his dream job, let him fix himself later. But the memory of that pharmacy counter came back, where I once begged for minutes of life for him. And I realized, staying silent now would be like lying for him. And if anyone has to teach him one last lesson in decency, it has to be me. I typed my response. I confirmed that I did not participate in any projects listed in the attached application. I did not sign those documents and never acted as a guarantor for Benjamin Carter during his internship at Southwest Urban Design. The signatures in the application were not provided by me. I read it twice. No malice, no bitterness, just the truth. And I hit send. Half an hour later, my phone rang. It was Ben. I didn't pick up. A text came almost immediately. "Dad, you got that email right? Please don't say anything yet, let me explain." Then a second. "It's not as serious as you think, just to get through the application round." And a third, colder. "Are you really trying to ruin my career?" I didn't reply, but in my heart I knew I wasn't ruining anything. I was just keeping a truth from being buried by what my son thought was clever. I stood up, went straight to the room with my old files, and pulled out the designs I'd stayed up nights to finish. The originals, real signatures, ink smudged from trembling, sleepless hands. I looked at them, like looking at myself, a father who lived his whole life with honesty, and today chose to keep his dignity, even if it made someone else fall. And if my son crumbles because of one verification letter, then maybe he was never truly standing on his own feet. The last text from Ben came near midnight. "I just needed you to look the other way one last time. Just once. After this, I'll handle things myself. I swear." I read each word over and over, not because I was wavering, but because I wanted to understand exactly what my son was asking. To look the other way, one last time. To turn a blind eye to wrongdoing. Complicity dressed as family. He didn't say, "Help me, Dad," or "Forgive me, Dad." He said, "Look the other way. Those two words cut through the old trust I'd used to build his entire world. Look the other way. I remembered the time I refused a bribe when fixing a town project. When someone slipped an envelope into my pocket at a coffee shop, I gave it back immediately. They called me hard to play. I just smiled. I don't sell for a few $100 what I teach my son every night. Now that same son was telling me to do what I told him never to do. Look the other way. That night, I didn't sleep. I went out to the porch, sat on the creaky wooden chair, and looked up at the pitch-black sky. Clouds passed like things never named. I kept thinking about one last time. What's the last time? Who decides what's last? You don't lose decency in one night. It slips away bit by bit with each overlooked act, each blind eye. Until one day, you no longer know what's wrong. I'd seen it happen. An old friend of mine, also a father, once said he'd just help his kid dodge a small mistake by lying for a scholarship application. Then came the second, the third. 10 years later, his son was prosecuted for financial fraud in a public project. That father sat in the courtroom, head bowed, saying, "I thought I was helping him. I don't want to sit somewhere 10 years from now saying the same thing." I stood up, went inside, opened my computer, and wrote an email to Ben. Short, I replied to the recruiter honestly. Not because I don't love you, but because I don't want you to build a career on lies. I won't look the other way because I didn't raise you to be that way. And if you blame me now, know that I'd rather be blamed than let you lose your way forever. I didn't send it right away. I read it again, and when I saw nothing needed changing, I hit send. Right after my phone rang, it was Ben. I didn't answer. A minute later, another text. "You sent that email to them, didn't you? You killed my only chance." I looked at the message, not angry, just sad. Sad because my son didn't understand. Real chances are never built on shadows. I set the phone down, looked at the old photo on the bookshelf, me and him at his high school graduation. He had his arm around me, grinning wide. That day, he said, "You're why I try every day, Dad." I believed it. And I still want to believe that somewhere in my son today, there's still a part that remembers that feeling, still wants to be a decent person. And for that to happen, this father can't look the other way, not even one last time. The preliminary hearing opened on a clear autumn morning, but my heart felt heavy as stone. Not because I was the defendant, but because my son was the central figure in the indictment, charged with 3 counts related to falsifying job application documents and forging signatures on work materials. I sat in the back row, just close enough to see the back of his head as he stood at the podium. He didn't turn to look at me once, but I knew he knew I was there. The plaintiff, representing the architecture firm in San Diego, presented each piece of evidence clearly, from the copied signatures to the reports falsified from my own files. The prosecutor read the charges, each word drawing blood from my heart. Exploiting the trust of a family member for personal gain, causing damage to the reputation of the receiving entity, and seriously violating professional ethics. I didn't look up. I was afraid that if I did, I wouldn't bear seeing the eyes that once sparkled with pride when I taught him 3rd grade math, now filled only with confusion, fear, and disappointment. When it was his turn to speak, he pulled out a thrice-folded A4 sheet from his briefcase. The paper was creased, its edges worn, likely read dozens of times. He spoke with a trembling voice. "I request permission to read my handwritten statement." The court allowed it. He took a deep breath and began. "Dear Honorable Court, my name is Benjamin Carter. I was wrong. I let the fear of failure lead me down the worst path, deceit." His voice cracked. I couldn't see his face, but I heard the paper shaking with each breath. "I took my father's signature, the man who sacrificed everything to raise me, and turned it into a tool for a fake resume. I was wrong from the very first thought that if no one found out, it wasn't a crime. I wrote this by hand because I didn't want to edit, delete, or embellish. I wanted every stroke, every spelling mistake, if there was one, to be the rawest truth of a son relearning a lesson in ethics from scratch. I'm not asking for acquittal. I only ask for a chance to start over." His final words broke apart. He folded the paper, hands gripping it tightly. The courtroom was silent. Only the soft autumn breeze came through the window. I looked down at my hands, calloused from years of fixing machines, building houses, mending fences, hands that once hoped to be held by my son with pride. Then the judge delivered the verdict. Due to the defendant's cooperation, sincerity, first-time offense, and no significant direct economic damage, the court sentences him to 12 months of non-custodial reform, 180 hours of community service, and mandatory participation in a professional ethics training course. When the verdict was announced, I didn't sigh in relief, nor did I feel lighter, only a strange sensation like a train leaving the station without turning back. After the hearing, I left quietly, but as I passed through the hallway, I heard footsteps running. "Dad," his voice. I stopped. He stood there, thinner, his eyes no longer sparkling like before, but full of cracks. He held out the statement he'd read. Dad, can you keep this? I stayed silent, then nodded. I took the crumpled paper, folded it, and tucked it into my inner pocket, where I once kept a letter my wife wrote before she passed. Not because I forgave him, but because I understood. No statement matters as much as the truth written by the hands that erred. And from then on, I began to think. Perhaps, after all, the final lesson this father could teach wasn't punishment, but letting his son learn to rise from the rubble he caused. A week after the trial, I received an email from an unfamiliar address. No subject, just the sender's name, Benjamin.Carter89 @ I hesitated for a few seconds, then opened it. The content was brief, just 2 paragraphs. Dad, I know I don't deserve your reply, but I still want to say thank you for coming to the trial, for not looking the other way when I was wrong, and for staying silent all this time, not smearing me in public, not telling relatives, not lowering my dignity any further, though I know I deserved it. The night before, when I sat writing my statement, I didn't know where to start, but I remembered the photo of you and me at my graduation, you standing behind me, hand lightly on my shoulder, as if reminding me that no matter where I go, I'm not alone. That day, I proudly told my friends, that's my dad, the man I respect most. Then I became the one who used you as a shield for my failures. I have no excuse. Below was a blank line, then another paragraph, longer, quieter. Dad, I'm now in non-custodial reform. Community service starts next week. Sweeping parks, helping the elderly in the neighborhood. The old company won't take my application back, and I don't blame them. I'm planning to study again, an evening course in construction management from scratch, no longer using your name or anything of yours. I'll go it alone, no one's backing me. But before I start over, I have one request. If you think it's not right, just pretend you never read this. But if you still have your first design, the one you called the blueprint of a lifetime, the one you made when you married Mom, can you lend it to me? I remember you saying, this is the only one I kept, not for the project's value, but because it marked the moment I knew I'd build something longer lasting than a house. I want to keep it, hang it on my new study room's wall to remind myself every day, to be a man, you start with the foundation. If you agree, I'm not asking to keep it forever, just to borrow it, for a while. Thank you, Dad, and I'm sorry, for the last time. Signed, Ben. I read it and didn't reply right away. I stood up, walked to the storage room at the end of the hall, the dusty room where I kept things I thought no one remembered. His first walking shoes, the metal lunchbox with a dinosaur print, the unfinished letter his mother wrote in the hospital, and that blueprint, folded thrice, tucked in an old leather-bound notebook in the bottom drawer. I took it out, spread it on the table. The hand-drawn lines were still clear, a simple 2-story house, large windows facing a garden, 2 tiny figures playing under the trees. I'd drawn them as future son when his mother asked. I don't know why I kept it till now, maybe because I never got to build that house for real. But now perhaps Ben would be the one to lay the first brick. I went back to my desk, clicked reply, wrote 1 sentence. The blueprint is on its way, son. But remember, a foundation isn't borrowed. You dig it, pour it, and take responsibility for it. I hit send. And for the first time in a long while, I felt a little lighter, not because everything was okay, but because I knew I still had a chance to teach my son one last thing. Not with words, but with trust. One more time. I'm not the type to hold grudges. Life taught me that anger only tires your heart, while the one who wronged you doesn't care. But that doesn't mean I let myself be erased from my own story. I don't need my son to apologize with flowers or gifts, nor do I need anyone in the family to call me the pillar again. I just need the truth to stay intact. And what I did, my sacrifices, not to be pushed into a corner as if they never existed. In the months after the trial, I got no more messages from Ben. I didn't send any either. Sometimes I heard whispers from neighbors that someone saw him sweeping leaves in the park. Head down, quiet. Then the news faded. I didn't seek it out. I let things rest. But every night before bed, I still opened the glass cabinet, looking at the one photo I didn't take down after that abandoned wedding day. The old picture of the 3 of us in front of the moving truck on our first move. I was thinner then, hair not yet gray, arm around my son's shoulder, his mother smiling behind the camera. Back then I thought, as long as our family stays close, nothing could tear us apart. But the real separation didn't come from physical distance. It came from denial, from texts like, Dad, don't embarrass me, from being removed from the group chat, from my image and signature being used as tools to paint a false picture. And what I could never let go, never, was being treated as if I didn't exist. But then one March morning, I received a thick envelope from a community college. The sender was the board of directors. I opened it. Inside was a neatly handwritten letter, along with a special invitation. We cordially invite Mr. Thomas Carter to attend the final project defense of student Benjamin Carter, Construction Management Reintegration Program. At the bottom was his familiar slanted handwriting. Dad, I want you to come, even if you just stand in the back. But I want you to hear this part. I folded the letter, not rushing to reply, but I marked the date on my calendar. That morning, I wore a white shirt, the only one I kept after the wedding. I arrived 15 minutes early. The presentation room was small, about 20 people. I sat in the back, quiet. Ben walked in on time, holding a rolled-up blueprint, his eyes scanning the room and pausing briefly when he saw me. No wave, no smile, just a slight nod. Enough. He began his presentation with a line that nearly stopped me. I chose the topic, the foundation of trust, not because it's technically advanced, but because it's where I first collapsed in my own life. The room stirred, but he didn't falter. He went on, explaining a construction system designed not just to technical standards, but with cross-checking ethics, preventing fraud, blocking post-approval report changes, and requiring clear responsibility at every stage. I recognized details similar to a system I made in 2005, but this time improved, with anti-abuse measures I hadn't even thought of. And then at the end, he quietly opened the final slide, a 3D rendering of a small house with a garden, 2 childlike figures under a tree. I held my breath. It was my first blueprint, perfectly recreated in 3D, displayed on the last slide like a reminder. Ben turned to the panel. I want this project to be a beginning, not for a career, but for redemption. Then he looked at me. His eyes, for the first time, didn't look away. And for my father, who didn't seek revenge, didn't expose me, didn't shame me in public, who stayed silent so I could face my own shadow. The room clapped. I didn't, I just nodded lightly. Because in my heart, all the applause couldn't match that nod of acknowledgement. You understood. After I meant to leave right away. But Ben ran after me in the parking lot. Dad, I turned. Can we someday talk again? Not for forgiveness, just so I don't forget your voice. I looked at him, the young man who was once the boy hiding behind me, now standing there, hands clenched. I placed my hand on his shoulder. I didn't seek revenge, Ben, I said calmly. I just didn't let myself be forgotten. That's the difference. His eyes welled up. He nodded. No more words. A week later, I received a package. Inside was the 3D blueprint from his presentation, printed on sturdy paper, with a small note. Returning this to Dad, because I know, no matter how perfectly I rebuild it, it was yours first. I smiled, folded it up, and for the first time in a long while, I took out the toolbox I'd stored away since my last construction job. I decided to rebuild the wooden porch steps myself, where I'd sit, waiting for my son to stop by one afternoon. No need for many words, just so he knows I'm still here. I was never erased from his life. And if he truly changes, that change began with a father who dared to stay silent at the right time and stand up at another, not for revenge, just not to be forgotten. The story of a father rejected by his son on his wedding day, then witnessing his son's descent, mirrors a painful issue in American society today, the generational disconnect, especially when traditional moral values are tested by the pressures of success and social image. In modern America, where reputation, resumes, and achievements are often prioritized over integrity, it's not rare for young people to choose embellishment to get what they want. Ben's story, a young man forging his father's signature to impress an employer, clearly reflects the disorientation when ethics no longer anchor ambition. But what makes this story unique is the father's response. He didn't react with harsh punishment or public shaming, but with a calm, resolute stance, drawing a clear moral line. His refusal to look the other way when asked, his honest email to the recruiter, and even his presence at the trial as a responsible father, all show that love doesn't mean covering up. The lesson here is, in American society, where everyone has the freedom to choose and bear responsibility, parents must hold firm as moral guides. Leniency shouldn't mean compromise, and sometimes true love is daring to let your child face consequences, so they learn to stand, not from a protective embrace, but from the seeds of kindness, integrity, and respect for their roots you quietly planted in their heart from the start. If you believe that sometimes forgiveness comes from silence and steadfastness, hit subscribe to not miss stories like this. Thank you for listening to the end. See you in the next video, where we continue exploring the deepest corners of family and human hearts.